Though based at Oxford in his native England, Dr. Ward also teaches as professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University in Texas, where he is well beloved, teaching, yay Houston, teaching as part of the online program in Christian apologetics. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, the 22nd of November in 2013, Professor Ward unveiled a permanent national memorial to him in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey as part of a very special service which many of us were privileged to attend. Dr. Ward's chief claim to fame, as if anything could be better, is that he once had a cameo in the James Bond movie, The World Is Not Enough. There is a picture on his website if you don't believe me. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ward.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me back. It's great to be here in post-pandemic or nearly post-pandemic times. Good day to you too, those who are live streaming, especially those who can't be here in person because they do. Is the waterfall pretty or sublime? C.S. Lewis on Love and Objectivity. I'm going to be talking mostly about the abolition of man, which I've recently written a guide to. Here's my guide, After Humanity. But we're focusing on Lewis's work, not mine. And we're focusing, to begin with, at least, on the question of waterfalls. Is the waterfall pretty or sublime? You will remember, if you have read The Abolition of Man lately, that Lewis opens his account with an attack upon a book that he calls the Green Book, a book by Gaius and Titius, though actually the book was called The Control of Language and was by King and Ketley. But he spares their blushes because he's going to really lay into them by giving them this nom de plume. And the reason he wants to attack the Green Book is because the Green Book, which is supposedly a book about English composition, teaching children how to appreciate literature, actually smuggles in a subjectivist philosophy. The book, the Green Book, discusses the famous episode when Coleridge was looking at a waterfall, and this is how Lewis relates what the Green Book says. You remember there were two tourists present at the waterfall, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows: when the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion. So you see that what Gaius and Titius are propounding is a subjectivist philosophy. There's nothing inherently or intrinsically sublime about the waterfall that a well-disposed observer could detect and articulate. It's purely a projection of feelings. I think it's sublime. I feel sublime when I see it. But there's nothing objective about this sublimity. And if I happen to want to call it pretty instead, well, who are you to say that I'm wrong? Now that's subjectivism in a nutshell, and that's what Lewis is going to attack in The Abolition of Man. He's going to argue that if we adopt a subjectivist philosophy, we will be on a short route to abolishing our own humanity. That's why he calls his book The Abolition of Man. Now, of course, waterfalls are different. Some waterfalls are more sublime than others. Some little trickles we might want to call nothing more than pretty. But with a truly great waterfall like the Niagara Falls, the Victoria Falls, the Iguazu Falls, if you didn't reach for a word like majestic or sublime or awe-inspiring, you would be showing yourself to be insufficiently human. You would not have developed the organs of appreciation proper to our nature as human beings. By the way, here is a painting of the Cora Lynn waterfall in Lanarkshire, which is the waterfall that Coleridge and indeed Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth visited on that occasion. C.S. Lewis seemed to have been quite interested in waterfalls from a symbolic point of view. Remember that Lewis had said that he always wanted to be a poet. From the age of 16, he had a great ambition to be a poet above all things. And although he never succeeded in establishing much of a reputation as a versifier, although he did publish a lot of poetry throughout his life, he nonetheless had great poetic gifts. He understood how symbols work, how metaphors operate, how to use language to evoke, as great poetry does. And it seems to me that he was interested in the evocative, symbolic power of waterfalls. I say that partly because we find waterfalls in Narnia, at the beginning and end of the last battle. Remember how in the final heavenly climax of the last battle, the children and the animals all actually run up a waterfall, a gravity-defying run. There's the great cataract in Fars in Till We Have Faces, and perhaps most notably of all, a great waterfall in The Great Divorce. Let me read you a little bit about that waterfall. This is in the outskirts of heaven. And Lewis, who's narrating the story, says this: "Before me, green slopes made a wide amphitheatre, enclosing a frothy and pulsating lake, into which, over many-coloured rocks, a waterfall was pouring. I realized that something had happened to my senses, so that they were now receiving impressions which would normally exceed their capacity. On Earth, such a waterfall could not have been perceived at all as a whole. It was too big. Its sound would have been a terror in the woods for 20 miles. Here, after the first shock, my sensibility took both as a well-built ship takes a huge wave. I exulted. The noise, though gigantic, was like giants' laughter, like the revelry of a whole college of giants together, laughing, dancing, singing, roaring at their high works." And then a little bit later, as he approaches this waterfall, he hears that it actually can speak. The voice of the waterfall was quite unlike any other voice I had heard so far. It was a thunderous yet liquid voice. With an appalling certainty, I knew that the waterfall itself was speaking, and I saw now, though it did not cease to look like a waterfall, that it was also a bright angel who stood like one crucified against the rocks and poured himself perpetually down towards the forest with loud joy. This waterfall is a waterfall in Indonesia, and I was very pleased that when Word on Fire Academic produced my book, they used it as the cover image. I asked them to find a waterfall, and they found a spectacular one and a brilliant photograph, which was also freely available on Google Images. Fantastic. So C.S. Lewis was interested in waterfalls from a variety of points of view, poetic and philosophical. And I myself have sort of been keyed into Lewis's interest in waterfalls myself, ever since I saw that fantastic 1986 movie, The Mission. Now, you remember how The Mission opens with the Iguazu Falls in South America. And these majestic falls, you can't use any other word than majestic unless you use Sublime, really dominate the atmosphere of that fantastic movie, as does the soundtrack, the music composed by Ennio Morricone. possibly the greatest film music ever written, in my humble opinion. And I actually ended up dedicating After Humanity to the memory of Ennio Morricone, who died just as I was completing my work on that project. And you'll remember, if you've seen the mission, that it opens with a man on a cross, a crucified man. He's still alive, apparently, and we see him in an amazing opening shot, actually, or apparently, going over the waterfall. And we'll come back to the mission a bit later. But it was largely because of this opening shot in the mission that I began to think of, oh yes, there's that crucified angel in the Great Divorce who's a waterfall. And then there's this significant waterfall at the beginning of the abolition of man. Why is Lewis interested in this so much? So back to the abolition of man. Here's a poster showing you the advertising, the Riddle Memorial Lectures that gave rise to the abolition of man. I managed to track this poster down in the archives of the University of Durham. Lewis gave 3 lectures in February 1943, which were later published as The Abolition of Man. And as I was saying, and as you no doubt know yourself, though I can't assume that everybody has read The Abolition of Man, because it is one of Lewis's hardest works, although it's his shortest book, it's probably his densest book, pound for pound. So I won't assume that everybody has read it, or can remember it well. So excuse me if I'm telling you things you already know. The Abolition of Man talks about objective value, as opposed to subjectivism. Lewis is going to propound objectivity, objective value, but he's not going to call it natural law, as you might expect him to do. He reaches for a slightly unexpected term, the Tao. He reaches into Confucian philosophy and talks about objective value under this term. He says this: the Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao. It is the reality beyond all predicates. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. It is also the way which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. This conception, in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to, for brevity, simply as the Tao. Now, this linguistic move, this rhetorical strategy, sometimes perplexes people who come to The Abolition of Man from Lewis's more explicitly Christian apologetics. They assume that he's going to be starting from Christian premises in The Abolition of Man. Whether this position implies a supernatural origin for the Tao is a question I'm not here concerned with, he says. If you want to read how he develops his argument when that is a question he's concerned with, read the opening chapters of Mere Christianity, where Lewis makes a very similar case in essence to the case he makes in The Abolition of Man, but there advances to a defense of theism and then to Christianity. But in The Abolition of Man, as I say, he's much more narrowly focused, and as he says, though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I am not here attempting any even indirect argument for theism. And that's one of the reasons why The Abolition of Man has been approved and regarded as a very interesting and important work, even by people who would not call themselves theists or Christians, including, perhaps most notably, this man, John Gray, who's a British philosopher, still very much alive and working. John Gray is an atheist, but he, not so long ago on BBC Radio, gave a whole 15-minute broadcast about The Abolition of Man and why he thought it was a very significant work. He said it was prescient, it was prophetic, as relevant now, he said, as when Lewis wrote it in the 1940s, if not more so. And that's an atheist. Now that speaks to the validity of Lewis's belief, and indeed, the biblical position that indeed all human beings, having been made in the image of God, have a certain apprehension of right and wrong, including those who do not believe in God. They are still human beings, of course they are, and as such, they know something about right and wrong. They may even put some of us Christians to shame. I have not found such faith even in Israel, Jesus says about the centurion. And this is worth mulling over a bit, I think, particularly this week when we're discussing intellectual hospitality. We might want to say, we Christians can be intellectually hospitable to non-Christians, people from other positions. Yes, and they can be hospitable to us too, if they are atheists of goodwill, if they are Buddhists of goodwill, if they are Muslims of goodwill, if they do indeed recognize the natural law, the Tao, which we all have to conform our activity to. We will, of course, come to very different conclusions about certain kinds of activity and the ultimate end of our ethical behavior, but we will at least have a common ground in which we can properly and rationally debate with each other. Belief in the Tao, belief in the natural law is a kind of religion, a foundational, a fundamental religion that can be presupposed before we get to any other kind of religious commitment, such as Judaism, Christianity, Stoicism, and the rest. And indeed, atheism. Insofar as atheism is a rational system of thought, it also presupposes the Tao. I've mentioned my guide to the abolition of man. Another very good book on the abolition of man is this by Dennis Danielson, The Tao of Right and Wrong, Rediscovering Humanity's Moral Foundations, which I highly recommend. It's something actually of a rewrite of the abolition of man. Whereas Lewis, for instance, gives us men without chests in the abolition of man, Dennis Danielson gives us humans without hearts, updating the language a little bit in various ways. Let me read you one particular passage from this book, which I think is particularly relevant to our discussion this morning. Danielson says this: morality is not based on the Tao, not rooted in virtues that transcend politics, fail to establish the priority of right over might. If in declaring an act or attitude or behavior to be right or wrong, I am simply reflecting my emotional state or my subjective opinion, then unless you just happen to share that emotion or subjective opinion, you will not be morally persuaded to do the right or to refrain from doing the wrong. Certainly, you might be persuaded when you consider the consequences that I threaten to impose, but that is not genuinely moral persuasion. And it's no good appealing to cultural standards according to which one ought not to, for instance, destroy public property, for cultural values are just socially constructed or biologically determined subjectivities raised to a more than individual level, if subjectivism is true. To this extent, they are still merely contingent on something that is itself not fundamentally moral. They lack an appeal to or grounding in what Alistair MacIntyre calls the standards of normative rationality. And thus they entail, again, this is MacIntyre, an obliteration of the distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relationships. In short, without an appeal to the Tao, what pretends to be moral persuasion is really just coercion, might merely disguised as right. And so morality is reduced to nothing more than a construct that serves the interests of power. Now that strikes me as very true and very descriptive of a lot of what passes for supposed moral debate and moral persuasion in our culture in Britain and America right now. But back to the abolition of man. In the abolition of man, Lewis is going to argue that when you see a waterfall, which is indeed majestic, like the Iguazu Falls, if you fail to rise to the occasion and find it awe-inspiring, you've got an insufficiently developed set of passions. You need to work on developing your emotional intelligence. But it's possible also to have an insufficiently rational head. What connects the rational head and the emotional passions is the chest. It's the chest, Lewis argues, which is the definitively human faculty. He says this: the head rules the belly through the chest being the seat of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment, these are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he's mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal. The chest is the seat of magnanimity. Magnanimity, magnanimous, the great soul, literally. Animals have sense and appetite. They have a sensitive soul. Angels have a rational or spiritual soul. They are intellectual creatures, angels are. Human beings are both intellectual and appetitive, both cerebral and visceral. We can combine reason and passion, and we do that in the chest, philosophically considered. And it's working on that chest, developing it so that we can be both emotionally intelligent and intelligently emotional, that the abolition of man is written to support that conclusion. Now, as I was writing my book, After Humanity, I remember I Googled Jack Lewis, men without chests, just to see what came up. And a very interesting image came up, rather amusing image, this image. Now, this Jack Lewis was apparently a real man who I think lived somewhere in the East End of London, and he was a strong man, and he sold chest expanders. You see what he says there? Be strong, keep strong, by using the Jack Lewis Improved Progressive Expander. It will fortify your body with powerful muscles, strengthen your internal organs, and enable you to defy disease. And that's what our Jack Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, is also advising philosophically. But it's interesting that physically, when Lewis was a young boy, he had a notably weak chest. And his father, Albert, was quite concerned about it. Albert Lewis said, "I've never known a boy with a weaker chest." And when Lewis went off to school, he wrote a letter home saying, I've been condemned to do special exercises in the gym for those boys with weak chests. He had a very delicate chest. And you can sort of see it there. You can understand why this concern arose. And when he went off to Oxford, Lewis, at least briefly, began to learn to row, apparently. I don't think he can have done it for much more than probably one outing, because there's no record of it that I've discovered in in his own letters or diaries, but his father Albert does say, oh good, he's learning to row. Rowing, there's nothing better than rowing for putting a chest on a man. So I wonder whether some of this medical and physiological concern about his actual chest didn't play into the development of his ideas about the philosophical chest. And we find a similar interest transposed into imaginative language in the Narnia books. You remember how Peter Pevensey, at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we're told that Peter Pevensey has grown up to become a tall and deep-chested man. That's no accident, I'm sure. And in the final Chronicle of Narnia, Shift, the ape, tells us that apes always have weak chests. What weak chests apes always have? Well, of course, because apes are merely aping what it means to be human. They cannot do it in reality. So we've got a philosophical interest in the chest, a medical or physiological interest in the chest, a sort of literary, symbolic interest in the chest. So we're not just talking here today about waterfalls, we're also talking about the thorax. Alistair MacIntyre, who I've already referred to, or Dennis Danielson has referred to, in his great work After Virtue, develops a very similar case, I think, to Lewis's case in The Abolition of Man, except done with greater detail and sophistication. After Virtue is a fantastic work of philosophy. If you haven't read it, do. Indeed, I'm nodding to it, After Virtue, in the title of my book, After Humanity. And Alistair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, himself, as it were, zeroes in on the chest, or rather the absence of the chest, by referring to three other philosophers who have concentrated too much on the head, too much on the belly, and forgotten the chest altogether. This is what MacIntyre says in After Virtue. Just as David Hume seeks to found morality on the passions, that is to say, on the belly, because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on reason, so Immanuel Kant founds morality on reason, because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on the passions. And Kierkegaard on criterionless fundamental choice, because of what he takes to be the compelling nature of the considerations which exclude both reason and passion. Too much belly, too much head, and in Kierkegaard's case, just a sort of leap of faith which regards both. We're like that drunken man in Martin Luther's Table Talk who, remember, he falls off the mule on one side, gets back in the saddle, falls off the other side. Why not just sit soberly in the middle? Why not actually just focus on the chest and find a way of combining reason and passion? That's what Lewis is doing in The Abolition of Man, but he's also fully cognizant of the fact that we make men without chests and still expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. One of the most memorable and indeed memeable lines from The Abolition of Man. Men without chests, humans without hearts. As I've been saying, The Abolition of Man is not an explicitly Christian work, but it is entirely compatible with Lewis's Christianity. And one of the implicit ways in which we see Lewis's Christianity coming through The Abolition of Man is in his recurrent discussion of death for a good cause. Lewis repeatedly recurs to that maxim by Horace, the ancient Roman poet, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and seemly to die for one's country. And that's where we're going for the rest of this talk. Here's what Lewis says. When a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he said. He was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared and which he believed to be in accord with the value which his judgment discerned in noble death. He was giving the boy the best he had, giving of his spirit to humanize him as he had given of his body to beget him. Now, Lewis zeroes in on this, death for a good cause, as the critical experiment, the experimentum crucis of the objectivity of value. Because as soon as right behavior becomes painful or difficult or troublesome to us, we begin to find whether or not we really believe in its objectivity or not. For as long as it's convenient and painless, doing the right thing might just be convenient. But when it turns out to be possibly costing us our life, or at least our health, and yet we still are required to go through with it, then we realize, oh yeah, this is actually an objective thing, which requires me to conform myself to it, even at great cost. That's why Lewis keeps harping on this theme. Because, of course, Lewis himself had been an officer in the First World War. He knew battle from within. This is the only photograph of Lewis in uniform. This is him in the officer training corps in the billet just down the road at Keble College. And this is a photograph showing you the whole corps, including Paddy Moore. Paddy Moore is the man in the bottom left with the moustache. Lewis and Moore met in the billet at Keble College in a carpetless little cell with 2 beds, as Lewis referred to it. And they seem to have been put in this room together simply because of the alphabetical arrangement of the billet. Lewis, Moore, L.M. Just goes to show you how the alphabet rules our lives in ways we do not know. Because, of course, this relationship turned out to be pivotal for Lewis's future. The 2 men struck up a friendship, and they promised each other that if one of them was to die, that the surviving man would look after the dead man's family. And when Paddy, alas, was killed, Lewis kept his promise and looked after Paddy's mother and sister for many years afterwards. They lived in a household together for decades. This is the graveyard in France where Paddy Moore's headstone is to be found. This is the headstone. Second Lieutenant Edward Francis Moore, M.C. He was awarded the Military Cross posthumously. As you see, he died in March 1918. And around the same time that Paddy was, alas, losing his life, C.S. Lewis was very nearly losing his. In the spring offensive of 1918, Lewis was blown up by a British shell, ironically, a shell that fell short. It was zooming over toward the German lines, but fell short, exploded in his trench, annihilated the man next to him, spattered Lewis full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for decades afterwards. And he had an out-of-body experience. The picture arose in my mind, he said, of a man dying. But it was dry and factual and unemotional. It was like a fact in a textbook, he said. This thought, oh, I'm dying. Of course, he didn't die. He survived by a hair's breadth and was invalided back to England and spent another 6 months recovering from his war wounds. But he very nearly gave his life for his country. And he saw other men do precisely that. So when he discusses the Horatian maxim, dulce et decorum est, it comes with some sort of, first of all, first-hand experience, and second of all, with a kind of moral authority. We can debate how adequately Lewis discusses this question. Malcolm Guite has some very interesting thoughts on that very question, which I quote in After Humanity. But the point I'm the reason I'm talking about dulce et decorum est is because I think of it as a kind of stalking horse for a more Christian proposition. Namely, Jesus' words, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Now, Lewis slips in Jesus' words just once in The Abolition of Man. Most of the time he's focusing on Horace, the ancient Roman, the apparently non-Christian ethic. But just once in The Abolition of Man, he does slip in Jesus' words. This is where he does so. An innovator in values, that is to say, a subjectivist in values, regards dulce et decorum and greater love hath no man as mere irrational sentiments, which are to be stripped off in order that we may get down to the realistic or basic ground of this value. So just very briefly, very subtly, Lewis slips in the dominical statement, greater love hath no man, alongside the Horatian maxim. But that should clue us into the fact that Lewis is seeing that Horace and Jesus saw the same truth. They saw the value in self-sacrifice. A righteous pagan can see it, yes. So can our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And he can not only see it as a truth, but he can enact it in his own person by virtue of his divine office. The head rules the belly through the chest. That phrase about the head and the belly being linked by the chest occurs in another of Lewis's works, his essay on Christian apologetics. So let's have a brief digression into Christian apologetics, where Lewis is talking about religions and says this: "We may divide religions, as we do soups, into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. Now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly." And in Lewis's view, there are really only two religions which seriously treat both head and belly. And in his view, they are Hinduism and Christianity. But in Hinduism, he says, the two are not really united. The hermit with his metaphysics is completely separate from the ritual prostitution in the temple. They never meet. But in Christianity, he says, a primitive African convert is told to obey an enlightened universal ethic, whereas I, he says, a 20th century academic prig, am told to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the lamb. The savage has to become clear, I have to become thick. That is how one knows one has come to the true religion. So Christianity, in Lewis's view, is the religion that most successfully unites head and belly, that demonstrates most fully the development of the chest, the definitive human faculty, without which we abolish ourselves. Now, Christ, of course, is the archetypal self-sacrificer. Other people sacrifice themselves, they die for good causes, but Jesus does it perfectly. He is the perfect penitent. And because he is perfect, it is all the more disagreeable for him than it would have been for any of the rest of us. Let's look at what Lewis says in The Problem of Pain on that topic. We agree with Aristotle that what is intrinsically right may well be agreeable, and that the better a man is, the more he will like it. So the more virtuous you are, the more you find pleasure in doing the virtuous thing. But we agree with Kant so far as to say that there is one right act, that of self-surrender, which cannot be willed to the height by fallen creatures unless it is unpleasant. The doctrine of death, which I describe, is not peculiar to Christianity. Nature herself has written it large across the world in the repeated drama of the buried seed and the rearising corn. The Indian ascetic, mortifying his body on a bed of spikes, preaches the same lesson. The Greek philosopher tells us that the life of wisdom is a practice of death. We cannot escape the doctrine by ceasing to be Christians. It is an eternal gospel, revealed to men wherever men have sought or endured the truth, the unescapable knowledge, which the light that lighteneth every man presses down upon the minds of all who seriously question what the universe is about. Now, interestingly, the abolition of man, not an avowedly theistic or Christian work, nonetheless repeatedly discusses self-sacrifice, the archetypal example of which, the perfect example of which, is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And interestingly, Lewis, as it were, raises his cap or tips a wink to that very sacrifice in the very final words of the abolition of man. The last quotation in the appendix, where Lewis is talking about the law of magnanimity, is Jesus' words from the Gospel of John. Verily, verily, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it. Those are the very final words of the abolition of man. And it's an indication of where Lewis believes that the chest has found its fullest development. Because, of course, our Lord is himself the seed above all seeds, who dies and whose death bears much fruit. But if we love our life in a self-protective way, we will lose it. And so we come to the question of love. The objectivity of love is the subtitle of my talk today. To love at all is to be vulnerable, Lewis says in The Four Loves. To love at all is to be vulnerable, to risk suffering, to acknowledge the objectivity of righteousness and to fulfill righteousness even at the cost of one's own suffering. That is the loving thing to do. It's not just right, it's not just courageous, it is loving. That hideous strength is the fictional counterpart to the abolition of man. And you will remember how, at a crucial moment in that hideous strength, Mark Studdock is told to trample on a crucifix. And if he doesn't, the consequences for him will be very unpleasant. This is his moment of truth. This is his crucial experiment last. But this image is actually no absolute improvement upon this image. Why not? Because although, yes, the man is working on his chest and he's got his belly in order, there's no head visible in this picture. Reason needs to be controlling the chest and the belly. This is the ideal situation. And as soon as one looks at this image, of course, it's but a short step to this image. And so we return to where we came in. The crucified angel pouring himself down with loud joy. Love is a giving away of oneself, an abdication. I don't know if you've seen The Mission, but if you haven't, really you should go and see it immediately or re-watch it. It's a fine, fine film, starring Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons, directed by Roland Joffe. And I'll just quickly talk about this before I end, because it provides a nice way of bringing these ideas together, I hope, and then we can have 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A. So in The Mission, after the priest has been martyred, the man on the cross, after he's drowned and been killed, another priest, played by Jeremy Irons, returns to this Guarani tribe in in South America. And he climbs the falls. He climbs up to where this tribe's folk live, and he plays his oboe. And the music-loving Guarani cluster around, and they think, well, a man who can produce such beautiful music can't be here to hurt us. And he begins to win their trust. And he begins to spread the gospel again, despite the sacrifice of Father Julian, the man on the cross at the beginning of the movie. In a separate strand of the story, the strand to do with Robert De Niro is playing the part of a mercenary and a slave trader. He's often been capturing these Guarani tribesfolk and enslaving them. He's a violent man. He knows nothing about love. And indeed, he kills his own brother early on in the movie, and then feels horrific remorse and guilt. Jeremy Irons comes to Robert De Niro and says, you need to pay a penance. You need to man up and own this guilt that you have committed. And the way that transpires in the movie is that Robert De Niro ties a huge bundle of weapons and armor in a great sack and hauls it up the falls with the aid of Jeremy Irons. So he goes up towards the very people that he would earlier have enslaved. And when he reaches them on the plateau at the top of the waterfall, one of them comes at him with a knife. And De Niro thinks he's about to be killed, as he deserves. He's killed his own brother. He's enslaved these people. But instead, the knife is used to cut the rope of the burden that he bears, and it rolls down the hillside into the river, and it is the most marvelous scene of forgiveness and transformation. De Niro weeps with joy, with sorrow, with relief, and himself enters the Jesuit order and becomes a priest alongside Jeremy Irons. But as the story progresses, alas, De Niro slides back. When the mission comes under threat from the Portuguese authorities, De Niro thinks, the only way to save the mission is to take up arms again. He goes back to his old violent ways. And in a marvelous scene between the two men, Jeremy Irons says to De Niro, you mustn't do this. You are a priest. You must sacrifice yourself before you start taking other people's blood. Jeremy Irons says this, if might is right, love has no place in the world. Back to C.S. Lewis. The distinguished Victorian historian G.E. Young once said that if you want to understand a man, a good question to ask is, what was going on in the world when he turned 20? That's a line which is often mistakenly attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was this historian who said it. What was going on in the world when Lewis turned 20? The end of the First World War. When he turned 20, it was the same month that the armistice was signed. Lewis had seen men die on the battlefield. He himself had nearly died. He had to ask himself, is there such a thing as objective value? I've seen men suffer. I myself am suffering. Can it be right to die for a good cause? Why would you die for a good cause? That's not good for you. Can it still be good nonetheless? Interestingly, and I'll now quote from the final chapter of my After Humanity, he had that dry, factual vision of himself dying, and that near-death experience seems to have had relatively little effect upon him at the time, or at least not one that we can trace through diaries and letters. A combination of Lewis's own youthful resilience and British stiff upper lip seemed to have preserved him from any obvious and immediate reaction. But a few years later, in 1922, Lewis gives a glimpse of evidence of what is perhaps delayed shock. Lewis writes in his diary, "I woke up late this morning in such a state of misery and depression as I never remember to have had. There was no apparent reason, really rather ridiculous. Found myself in tears. For the first time for many a long day, while dressing, I concealed this as well as I could, and it passed off after breakfast." Now, this is one of the very few occasions on which Lewis is on record as weeping. He's still a young man. He's still not fully familiar with those reaches of the Tao which would validate his tears. He needn't be ashamed of them. They are an appropriate reaction. And later in life, he reproaches himself for his tendency towards emotional reserve, writing to his friend Cecil Harwood, whose wife Daphne was dying of cancer. He signed off the letter with these words, "Love to you both. I wish it were of better quality. I am a hard, cold, black man inside, and in my life have not wept enough." And in a closely related spirit of late life soul searching, he writes a marvelous poem which opens with these words, "Love's as warm as tears. Love is tears. Pressure within the brain, tension at the throat, deluge, weeks of rain, haystacks afloat." If you want to understand the abolition of man, I think a good summary way of getting at it is by reference to the two quotations that Lewis uses from the Roman poet and satirist Juvenal, who was alive around about the same time as St. Paul. Early on, Lewis quotes this line from Juvenal, "This I will, so I command. Let my will take the place of reason," except he quotes the Latin, "Sic volo, sic jubeo, sit pro ratione," whatever it is, "sit pro ratione voluntas." And that's the archetypal subjectivist position. If I will it, so it is. If I say the waterfall is pretty, it is pretty. And there's nothing objective about it that you and I can argue about to come to a better description of it. Whatever I say goes. This is a fundamentally subjectivist and irrational position. Might takes the place of right. There's no disputing, there's no debating possible with a person who takes that position. That's what Lewis is arguing against. But again, in the appendix to The Abolition of Man, Lewis quotes Juvenal, saying this, "Nature confesses that she has given to the human race the tenderest hearts by giving us the power to weep. This is the best part of us." Power is not necessarily a bad thing. Might is not necessarily an evil. It just has to be in right relationship with the right. The power to weep is that right relationship. And whether that sort of waterfall, tears, weeping, should be characterized as sublime or pretty or something else, is not something Lewis goes into in The Abolition of Man. Thank you very much.